Welcome to the Hoop Collective podcast. We talk about the NBA, which we are doing on Thursday just before midnight. The NBA's draft second round is happening. Sorry, future Nikola Jokic, we're recording this podcast during the second round. Joining me from Barclays Center down the hall from where the draft is happening is in Brooklyn, New York, is Tim Bontemps.
Hello, guys.
And joining us from the Dallas Mavericks facility. What's the name of the facility? Do they have a special name after a hospital system?
There's a corporate sponsor that is, I think there's a corporate sponsor, but I'm not quite sure which it is at this point. So we'll just call it the Mavs practice facility. Used to be in the same building as Community Brewing Company, which I was much fonder of that arrangement. No longer is. They're down the street now.
Joining us from the Dallas Mavericks practice facility, and where the Mavericks were very active in the draft tonight, which we'll be talking about shortly, is Band MacMahon.
Howdy, partners.
Apparently banned from Community Brewing.
Not banned, it's just not, can't just kind of slip right next door.
Right. Okay, we had an eventful NBA draft day. It's still going on, I guess, but the big event happened a couple hours before the draft. Chris Paul rerouted from the Washington Wizards to the Golden State Warriors. I'm not sure if this qualifies as light years ahead, but I have to say, I said this on the Hoop Collective draft show, which I don't know if any of you guys checked out tonight that we did. I thought it was way better than I thought it was going to be. I actually thought we had some great panelists. Kevin Pelton, Kurt Goldsberry, King McClure, Trey Murphy, Christine Williamson hosted it. It was great while you guys were working. Check it out. It's on YouTube. It's 3 hours long. I'm not expecting to watch the whole thing, but we had fun. Okay, so Chris Paul gets rerouted there. And the first thing I thought about MacMahon was this. 2019 second round of the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
This is the year after Chris Paul pulled his hamstring.
After a hamstring away. Mm-hmm.
Hamstring away. So the next year they are playing the Warriors in game 4. Durant pulls his calf muscle, or is it game 5? Game 5.
Game 5, I believe. Yes.
So the Warriors the Rockets get to play the Warriors, which Chris Paul talked about the other day, that all they were was set up to play the Warriors that year, and they get to play the Warriors without Kevin Durant. They lose game 5,
mm-hmm.
which was supposed to be like their great opportunity because Durant went down in that game. Steve Kerr walks into the post-game podium and calls his team effing giants.
Mm-hmm.
And then game 6, Steph Curry goes scoreless in the first half in Houston, and the Rockets still can't win the game.
What's Steph do in the second half?
I believe he had, 30?
33.
33. So this is what I remember. I am in the hallway outside the Warriors locker room as they're coming off the court. First off, even though they were 3-time champions at that point, they celebrated winning that series and eliminating the Rockets on their home court without Kevin Durant, probably akin to as if they had won the Western Conference for the first time. They were just short of dumping water on each other. That's how excited they were. And as they were running down the hallway to the locker room, they were shouting down the hall towards the Rockets locker room, F Chris Paul, F Chris Paul. They were done with him by then. And here we are. Well, 4 short years later, Chris Paul is a Warrior.
I think they were done with Chris Paul, but as I also think that was about, they were done with hearing about, if not for Chris Paul's hamstring, the Rockets would have beaten the Warriors in the Western Conference Finals the previous year. The Rockets were up 3-2. Chris Paul went down. That's the only reason the Warriors went on and went to win another championship. They were done with hearing that as well. But this is a fascinating trade, and it's for some of the stuff you're laying out here, it's going to be a fascinating fit. But really, if you just look at that Chris Paul, Steph Curry relationship, which dates back to when, Steph Curry was I'm not going to say unheralded because he was always known as, Del Curry's son growing up, but when he was a underrated recruit and, going to Chris Paul's camp growing up in North Carolina, Davidson went to his camp. And so early on, it's kind of this mentoring relationship. And then, they turned into rivals, and they turned into rivals when the Warriors, on the way to their first championship, beat the Chris Paul's Clippers in a playoff series. If you'll remember the game that Chris Paul hurt his hamstring, one of the great moments of that game was he hit a big shot, and as he's running back down the court, kind of did a little shimmy right up in Steph's grill. And so they go from kind of a mentoring type of thing to rivals to teammates now, and I assume that Chris Paul will be Steph Curry's backup.
Yeah, I think we've completely missed the point of this trade to this point. I don't know why we're spending all this time talking about Chris Paul from 5 years ago. This is an admission.
I just thought it was amazing. There was. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we haven't even said the name Jordan Poole. This entire thing is about an admission that the Jordan Poole extension was a failure, and that this entire year, going back to him getting punched in the face by Draymond Green, like that is the moment, and everything that's happened since then, it's hung over this team. And when when you had the new general manager of the Warriors, Mike Dunleavy, up on the stage Monday saying, we want to bring Draymond Green back, we want to have him part of the team, right? All the indications are the Warriors want to bring Draymond Green back. It seemed very hard to me when you go back and read what Ramona Shelburne wrote, talking to Jordan Poole during the second round of the playoffs against the Lakers. When you look at the way Jordan's season played out, even if you go, there were people saying on Instagram, he immediately unfollowed Draymond after he got him traded. It seemed very hard to believe you could have Jordan Poole and Draymond Green on the same team going forward for many reasons. I think from Jordan Poole's standpoint, perfectly justifiably and fairly. And when you look at the fact that the Warriors gave this guy a $140 million contract extension in October, and they're now trading him
123 in
incentives. Okay, if you want to say it's incentives, fine. It was 4 years, 140. You want to say it's 125
it was a max
guaranteed.
Contract.
They gave him a massive extension, and 6 months later, look, Chris Paul last year was probably as good or better than him, and maybe Chris Paul will help him this year, assuming he's on the team all the way through. But you have to look at this as the Warriors getting themselves out of a contract they didn't want to have. That's why they traded a future first and a second to take on 38-year-old Chris Paul on an expiring deal. That ultimately is what this is about. Going into the new CBA with the amount of money they've spent, Joe Lacob recently said, we're not going to, full steam ahead, we're going to win, blah, 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 blah. This was a cost-saving move, and them getting out of this deal. And maybe they'll turn Chris into something else. Maybe he'll be great, whatever. But to me, that's the underlying thing of this whole trade.
Yeah. Okay. First off, it's a first class salary dump. Okay. Because Chris Paul he still has the ability to contribute at a significant level.
He's still a good player, but they didn't trade for Chris Paul because he's Chris Paul.
I know. It's a salary dump and a chemistry cleanser. But as you point out, another thing here is that the Warriors traded a 2030
first round pick, top 20 protected.
2030 first round pick, which they're only allowed to trade after July 1st, right? I guess it's after the draft, right? After the draft, after July 1st.
I mean, after the draft. But this trade isn't happening until next month because it has to wait for Jordan Poole's extension to kick in.
That's right. Okay. So that means that they still have 2 first round picks. They can trade 2026 and 2028.
Well, yeah, technically they have to right now. They can only trade one because their pick goes out to 26, but it's only top 4 protected in next year's draft. They could easily do something with Boston, have it fully unprotected, and do it then.
Okay, fair. They have potential for 2 more first round picks they can trade, and they have pick swaps they can trade. And now they've brought in a $30 million expiring contract. So while I do believe that they are going to intend to play Chris Paul as their backup point guard, even though he started every game for 18 years. And I do believe that he can play an interesting role when Steph is off the court, and even under some circumstances together. We'll see what Steve Kerr plans. They also have a potential trade chip that they can use down the line here. Now, the other thing is,
you could argue they have you could argue they have $70 million in expiring contracts between him and
Because-
Klay Thompson, if you
because
really
of Klay
want to
Thompson.
look at it.
But I do think by moving Jordan Poole's money off of the books, they open up the possibility of retaining Draymond Green and Klay Thompson. It becomes more feasible. Again, I'll go back. They got Andrew Wiggins to take a pay cut. He went from 33 to 24. Draymond opted out of 27. Klay is making 43. If those guys are willing to take contracts that go out for a while and that come down in value, the come down is going to be a negotiation, I'm sure, or maybe even a descending contract. I think that there's room there for the Warriors to keep that core together.
No
And
question.
I was dubious of that before this trade. And so,
Well, they had to move somebody, right? They couldn't have all 5 of those guys on the books. Like, you could make 4 of them work with Looney.
Well, and
right?
they moved the
Couldn't make 5
guy
of
who
them work.
they moved the guy who Draymond punched in the face for a guy who Draymond at least used to want to punch in the face.
thank you, MacMahon. I couldn't have said it better.
Well, I do think it is interesting to your point about the Chris and Steph thing. The one basketball thing I do think is interesting is what have we talked about for a decade with the Warriors, right? They haven't been able to figure out a way to play when Stephen Curry is off the court.
Mhm.
The one thing you can say about Chris Paul is when Chris Paul is out there running the offense, you know how the Warriors are going to play, right? Because Chris Paul is always dictating how things are going to go. I do think that fit is potentially very interesting, and I do think it could be good. I just think the overall thing about this trade is much more about the Jordan Poole side of it.
For
than
sure.
Well, we have talked about how Chris wants to be close to his family. We sort of thought it would be in LA, but San Francisco is just as close as Phoenix. And
by the way, it's a chance to win, right? And by the way, one thing real quick, to talk about the Washington side of this for a minute. People have been killing the new people in Washington, Michael Winger, Will Dawkins, Travis Schlenk, their whole regime for the past week. I think insanely. Going
people
back
who
to
have
the
been
Bradley
killing
Beal
them
trade.
don't listen to this podcast and don't know the NBA.
I totally agree. I think these guys have done a great job when you look at what they did. They got 4 pick swaps and 6 second-round picks for Bradley Beal, a guy who had a no-trade clause and probably the worst contract in the league. They then turned Chris Paul.
I got to tell you, my jaw dropped when I saw 4 pick swaps. Was that out there? I didn't know it was going to be 4.
No. It was all the pick swaps they could trade. So they got everything they could possibly get from the Suns in that deal, which I'll get to at the end. Then I really like the fact that they got Jordan Poole and this first and second for Chris Paul, a guy who clearly had a limited trade market, which is why the Suns were shopping him around. I mean, it makes you wonder in a vacuum, would the Suns have been better off just trading Chris Paul for Jordan Poole? Like, that's an interesting debate. Like, instead of trading all this stuff for Bradley Beal, maybe I would just trade it for Jordan Poole instead. It's an interesting thing to think about. But that's a guy that I think long-term, the Wizards, I mean, he's going to be the centerpiece of the Wizards offense. He's going to get a ton of shots up. He's probably going to score a lot. He's a guy that going forward, I think can have value for them going forward. He averaged 24, 25 a game as a starter this year. And I thought they did a great job in this reworked Boston trade, which we'll also get to. Getting Tyus Jones, guy MacMahon knows a lot about from being in Memphis. Best backup point guard in the league. Very quality starting caliber point guard. Guy who's had the best assist turnover ratio in the league the past several years. And a high second round pick. Like, they turned all that into those, a new starting backcourt, and then made a smart move to go up and get a really intriguing player in the draft and Bilal Coulibaly, Victor Wembanyama's teammate. I think they had a great week.
Well, and again, the point for the Wizards is not to try to compete to be in playing contention with a month left in the season, which is what, that's been the definition of their last few seasons. The point is to get the hell out of that position and begin a real rebuild that is years overdue.
I think they've done a really good job. Really good.
And they may not be done. And
they're definitely not done. I mean, they've got Morris on the team. They could trade Tyus again if they wanted to. Like, they
could
got
sign
a lot
and
of
trade
things
Kyle
they could
Kuzma.
do.
They could sign
there's
and trade
another
Kyle Kuzma.
Absolutely.
I'd be calling San Antonio and asking
job.
if they want a good run your offense veteran point guard.
I'll tell you what, man. Yeah, either Tyus Jones or Monty Morris would be awesome. In San Antonio.
Who have assist to turnover ratio, rank right up the top. Just get you in your offense. Make sure Victor's getting the ball, getting the ball at his spots, running the show. I would call San Antonio and see if, who's loaded up on picks. I'd see if there's something there.
No question.
More Hoop Collective podcast after this.
Did you know YouTube TV is more than cable for less than cable? That's right. YouTube TV has no long-term contracts or hidden fees, and it even lets you catch up to the live game with key plays. This is an excellent feature. I don't even know how they do it, but it's excellent. I highly recommend it. With a lineup of over 100 channels, you can watch live TV just like cable. Signing up is simple. Get started in minutes. So what are you waiting for? Try it free today at youtube.com/NBA23. New users only. Terms apply. Cancel anytime. So they were getting, in the initial trade that was being discussed and never got consummated, with the Clippers, where it would have been Malcolm Brogdon as the primary piece going out from Boston instead of Marcus Smart. The Wizards were getting the 35th pick and Marcus Morris. There were some other things in there, but
30th pick.
I'm sorry,
Marcus
you're right.
Morris.
30th pick and Marcus Morris. Also, I think they were getting Danilo Gallinari, who they ended up getting anyway.
Yes.
Coffee.
Yes.
And Amir Coffey. So they end up pivoting and get Tyus Jones, who, Marcus Morris has some value, but Tyus Jones can be their starting point guard going forward if they want.
Marcus Morris has value as an expiring contract. Tyus Jones has value, period.
What's interesting is the previous regime in Washington considered going after Tyus Jones in free agency to be their starting point guard.
And by the way, there were multiple teams that were trying to get Tyus Jones. The Grizzlies apparently decided they were going to trade him, and there were a couple other teams, at least one that I know of, that thought they were close to getting Tyus Jones. So when that trade, when the Clippers and Celtics couldn't make the trade for involving Brogdon, another trade, at least one more trade that was gaining traction, fell apart for Tyus Jones, and they rerouted to go get Marcus Smart, which they gave 2 first-round picks for. Although the 2 first-round picks that Memphis gave are, just number 25 tonight, and the Warriors pick next year, which
we'll see what the Warriors pick is going to be. We'll see. They got an old team.
And I'm curious, would the Celtics have preferred Memphis's pick next year instead of the Warriors? That's kind of an interesting. I don't know the answer to that, but Memphis was at a point where they honestly did not want to draft a player this year because they've got more than enough developmental projects. They've drafted several players. And they needed to not have another young project type of guy on the roster and get somebody who could help them try to win right now.
They got the opposite of a young project in Marcus Smart. Now them very well, MacMahon. I know that you don't. It's not exactly breaking news that the Grizzlies needed some veteran voices in that room. Marcus Smart, who I have spent many times talking to after big games. He's a go-to guy to talk to, and I know you have too. Bontemps,
the go-to guy in Boston, in the heart and soul of the Celtics. I mean, that was a fascinating pivot, and for a variety of reasons. The second that Memphis got involved, I knew Marcus Smart was going to Memphis. The Grizzlies have been trying to get a guy like Marcus Smart, as our buddy Worldwide Wob, I think, perfectly tweeted after the trade. He's everything Dylan Brooks thought he was as a player. Yep. Like Marcus Smart is a perfect fit to me for what Memphis is looking for. And look, Washington benefited because they paid a price to get him. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around this trade from the Celtics standpoint. Like that, to go from Marcus Smart to Kristaps Porzingis, who had a great year last year, is a really interesting fit. It's just such a radical shift for who the Celtics are and how they play. It's going to be fascinating to see what they look like in a couple months.
They had this individual trade deadline for Kristaps Porzingis. Now Porzingis he had his option in his contract that was at midnight. This was negotiated
midnight Wednesday night.
Right. 4 years ago with the Mavericks, that it would be the day before the 2023 draft is basically the negotiation. The higher level player you are, the earlier your option tends to be. But June 21st is pretty early for an option. So
this is when the Mavericks gave Porzingis a full max contract with a player option, which, as you're pointing out, is a particularly favorable player option, despite the fact that He was coming off of an ACL and had never played a second for them.
And it's a great point. I forgot about that. And
Yep.
he had the option to extend. He could have, by mutual agreement, you could extend the option. You could have done it 24 hours. And they elected not to do that. When I say they, the Porzingis group elected not to do that. I asked one of the teams involved and they said, we asked and it wasn't an option. So Porzingis had reason to apply pressure, and Boston, under pressure, executed this trade. Now, I'm sure they had talked at length. It wasn't like the idea of trading Marcus Smart came up in the afternoon. They had obviously talked at length about whether or not they were going to be in position to trade Marcus Smart. And I will say that if you're going to trade Marcus Smart, getting Kristaps Porzingis, who averaged 23, 8, 1.5 blocks, shot almost 50% from the field, shot 39% from 3-point range, and 2 first-round picks, that is a tremendous return for a player that puts up the numbers that Marcus Smart puts up. But obviously, he is a legacy player with the Celtics, and it's hard to quantify. And obviously, it was a hard call for the Celtics. They wanted to better balance their roster. It was very clear they identified Porzingis as a guy they badly wanted, because they rammed this sucker through.
Which is interesting, because the places where Porzingis has been, I've talked to folks at both those spots, and I'm kind of like, we'll see for Boston. There's certainly some skepticism, and Porzingis had a great individual year last year where there was absolutely zero pressure on him, right? Because everybody
He also played 65 games for the first time since his second year. He's not been healthy, not just because of the knee, but because of the other stuff. Right?
Now they do have he's had back, he's had knee, both knees.
Well, I think it's safe to say he could have played more games last year, but they were in, shall we say, in a very conservative mode down the stretch in terms of wins and losses.
Yeah, and I also think, in fairness, Porzingis,
he played 65.
I think
no, I know. I'm saying he could have even played more. Is my point.
Yeah, I do think Porzingis has matured a lot, certainly since he was in New York, and even when he was in Dallas. I think getting traded the way he did from Dallas, he's talked about this, was a humbling experience. They do have a very interesting kind of 3 big rotation there now with him, Robert Williams, and Al Horford. And I think Porzingis can play with either of those other 2 guys. But, where both those guys are very switchy, Porzingis is certainly not. But, they got a player they wanted. They did get 2 first-round picks out of the deal, which I think you got to look at that and say, hey, that's pretty good value. But if I'm looking at this trade, I think the winners of the trade was the Memphis Grizzlies, simply because, like, Marcus Smart fills in so many of their needs, right? They needed a defensive stopper to replace Dylan Brooks. They had no intention of attempting to re-sign. Boom.
Yep.
You can check that off the list. They needed veteran leadership. And look, Tyus Jones is a solid vet, but I think there's a major difference in not only the way that his voice carries, but the way Marcus Smart is willing to use his voice and the impact that comes from a guy. Okay, hey, you guys have been out of the first round once. Okay, I've played however many playoff games he's played. He's been to the finals. Like, his voice is going to carry in that locker room. And then he's a different type of point guard from Tyus Jones, but he is a guy who can start 25 games at point guard while John Morant is not there, and then move over and he'll take the toughest defensive assignment 1 through 3, sometimes even 4, once Ja's in the starting lineup with him, and then he'll be their backup point guard at that point. So he fills a ton of, in some ways you can say he fills the roles played by both Tyus Jones and Dylan Brooks for the last few years.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right on that. I actually think from like a value standpoint, I would argue everybody in the trade won. I think it's sort of a everybody wins trade from that standpoint, but it's just so fascinating to see the Celtics go from thinking about doing a Brogdon trade, which would have been, I think, a really safe trade. Essentially would have just been Malcolm Brogdon for Kristaps Porzingis, which I really liked when I thought that was what the deal was going to be. And then, obviously it didn't go that way. But to go from what was a really safe trade to what was a wildly risky trade in doing this Marcus Smart deal for Porzingis and 2 firsts, like it's just
I don't know if it's wildly risky, but it's definitely a risk.
Well, here's
You're
why
risking your culture.
Here's why I'd say it's wildly risky, because to McMahon's point about the roster, right? The Celtics wanted, like you were talking, that they wanted to better balance out their roster. I would argue their roster doesn't really make a lot of sense right now. You have 3 essentially centers on your team who last year, what were we talking about, Brian, all throughout the playoffs and really all throughout the season? Joe Mazzulla was playing one of their bigs at a time, right? So now they've got 3 bigs.
He was doing that because he had to play his best lineups. He was to play his best players. He had to play too many perimeter players. That's what I mean by balancing the roster.
Well, yes, but my point is they now have 3 centers that I'm not sure, A, the coach is going to be super jazzed to play together, and B, I'm not exactly sure you can play all 3 of them or even 2 of them together.
Looks to me like they're trying to make him play them together.
Well, I think to me, it's a couple things. You could argue that. You could argue this isn't over yet in terms of making this roster over, right? As we've been doing the pod, the Celtics made about 9,000 trades moving down from 25. They got, I don't know how many second-round picks. I got confused literally trying to keep track of. Adrian just kept tweeting every couple minutes. The Celtics are moving down again a few spots. I think they ended up with 5 or 6 second-round picks from that 25th pick. So they moved a bunch of stuff around to do that. They obviously still have Malcolm Brogdon on the roster. They still have to figure out what to do with Grant Williams, who's a restricted free agent. They're up near the second apron. Like that, Marcus Smart was their not only the heart and soul of their team in a lot of ways, and they're sort of the vocal leader of the team, which they don't really have any sort of now. He also was their best passer, arguably. And while I think Derek White's terrific, and I think can more than capably step in and play point guard, like Kristaps Porzingis, as MacMahon knows especially, is not a great passer. Like he's great at other things, but like they've just so completely shifted the way their team is built by making this trade that I do think it's wildly risky. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think the value is really good. And now they also have a giant $36 million expiring contract with these 2 picks and other picks in the future. So maybe they decide to make some big swing down the road or something, but it just doesn't feel like they're done yet. And if they go into the season with some roster resembling what they have now, it's just going to be fascinating to see what it looks like, because it doesn't feel anywhere near like the team that I thought was the deepest team in the East last year.
One other thing I'll say about this trade, one of the reasons why I think it was value to Memphis is that Marcus Smart has 3 years at less than $20 million a year left on his contract, still in his prime years. To be in a market like Memphis and get a player like that for that price is extremely valuable.
Well, look, that's why they're trying to go after guys like Mikal Bridges, right? Like Zach Kleiman, the GM of the Grizzlies, is really identifying wing players, guard/wing players who are under contract that fit like exactly like MacMahon said, the kind of role they were trying to fill to allow Dillon Brooks to go elsewhere. And I think MacMahon said it perfectly. You look at what Marcus Smart does, I think he checks a lot of the boxes that Tyus Jones does and a lot of the boxes that Dillon Brooks does in one guy.
Yeah. And you can say, hey, when they're going Ja, Bane, Smart, boy, that's a little undersized, pretty undersized. Okay. But
Smart plays
Bane.
Smart defense.
So does Bane. Those guys are both tanks.
So does Bane. And you've got Jaren Jackson. They've got the last 2 defensive player of the year. Jaren Jackson Jr. swatting everything. And then, Steven Adams, if he's back healthy, and they don't end up moving him, then the strongest dude in the NBA.
Yeah. So, and I don't think any of these teams are done. I think all 3 of them are going to still be active in the next week. So we'll see what happens with Brogdon, whether they're able to move him. It's possible that, they have the future first round pick. They have other assets they've been able to pick up. So, and they still have some sell, Peyton Pritchard was going to be in the deal and he ended up not being in the deal. So they still have Peyton Pritchard they can aggregate in a trade. Okay.
I also think I'm going to check quick. I also think they have basically all of their future first too. I think they've traded 1 swap, but otherwise they have, they've traded 1 swap, But otherwise, they have
San
all their
Antonio.
first round picks. Yeah,
Yeah,
they've traded.
San
I have
Antonio.
all their first round picks though.
Okay, well, keep an eye on the Celtics. And it was a strong. Like, look, you may not be in love with Porzingis. That's a power move. It may have some risk to
Yeah,
it.
it's
That is
also
an
got a lot of
upgrade.
upside. It's a
Yeah.
fascinating trade. It's really fascinating.
Especially when we're not sure if Milwaukee's going to be able to keep its team together. We're not sure what Philadelphia is going to do regarding to keep its team together.
Miami also.
Well, we're going to talk about that right now. Okay.
Yeah.
So the draft ended tonight, and the Trailblazers used picks 3 and 23. They did not acquire a veteran. They did not make a big move. They did get Scoot Henderson, who they and a lot of people believe is a potential franchise player.
Mhm.
I have no idea if it'll work out or not, but there's a lot of people who I respect who believe that he could be. This is exactly what Dame said he did not want. He did not a youth movement. He wanted veteran help. I will give the qualifier that I have given in the past, which is that there are more ways for them to add veterans than just trade draft picks. They have other young players in their team they can trade. It doesn't mean that it's over, but I think especially when they didn't trade 23, it was kind of an, who knows what their offer was, but it was kind of, they've made their decision. So their hope, from what I understand, is just give Scoot a chance. Watch him play in Summer League. Come to training camp. Look how you fit with him. Like, what happens if you wait till Summer League and this guy looks like an absolute killer? We've seen this before. And I don't know what Dame's going to do, but I know that the teams out there who watch all this unfold are readying their offers for what happens. So we'll see what happens in the next couple of days, if not sooner. And we know who's going to be out there. We know that Miami is going to be there. We suspect that Brooklyn is going to be there. And my think is there's going to be another handful of teams that try to come knocking if/when Dame decides to make a move. And I don't know, Dame has said so many times that, the loyalty is there, and he shot down the rumor so many times. Maybe he wakes up tomorrow, maybe whatever they discuss with him. I think he's actually overseas right now, but
Yeah,
maybe whatever, I don't want to make any assumptions, but it is what it is.
I think what you said is important, right? That there's still time for Portland to do stuff. It's not like the offseason ended today, right? They have the ability to still change the roster, to improve the roster, to make moves. But this was certainly why we kept talking about this being a pivotal moment, because you have this third pick. I'm with you. I think Scoot Henderson is going to be awesome. I'm very happy for our guy, Mike Schmitz, that he got to Portland. I think he's going to be great there. But I think, to me, this was a pretty interesting moment to see, what are they going to do? Are they going to try to push in, try to be competitive with Dame, or are they going to take a more patient approach? Now, obviously, when it came to that pick, which, by the way, I think is the right move. I think if you have a chance to get a franchise point guard at 19 with where Portland's at, I don't think trading him for win now help makes sense for where the team is at. But now that they didn't do that, well, are there other moves they're going to make between now and sometime in free agency that will satisfy Dame and make him think, all right, we've got Scoop, but we're going in the right direction as far as being competitive? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But certainly this was a big moment to see a dramatic swing that would have said Damian Lillard is going to be in Portland. And I think what's safe to say is, I think the only responsible thing to say at this point is that what happened today at least leaves the door open for him to leave. Whereas opposed to them making a move would have closed it.
And Dame has cracked the door, right? He cracked the door in his exit interview, where he's made it very clear, I am not about a youth movement. He cracked the door wider when he was willing to talk about, oh, yeah, Miami would be really attractive. Yeah, Brooklyn too. Like, he
hasn't shied away from talking about the speculation.
Damian Lillard is as media savvy as any player in the NBA. He knows 100%. He knows when he entertains those possibilities exactly what the reaction is going to be. So, we shall see.
We shall. I feel like we're going to be talking more about that a lot in the coming days. There's nothing more to really say at this point. Okay, we'll see. All right, let's talk about the draft that happened tonight. some drama at number 2 and 3, but Gavoni had this one.
Props to our guy,
said-
Jonathan Gavoni. He was sitting next to me the whole draft. He had this giant Cheshire grin, fat grin on his face. He was so happy. He was nailing, him and Jeremy Wu were nailing draft picks left and right. I think he got like over 20 of his mock first round picks right. He was so happy. So shout out to Jonathan. Shout out to Jonathan, who's been saying for 6 weeks that Brandon Miller is going to be the pick and number 2. And he was the pick at number 2.
Yeah, and he stuck with it when there was pressure elsewhere. And so did Woj. Woj stuck with it as well. And just tremendous work there. And look, that was a big choice for the Hornets. One of the most important things that Mitch Kupchak said when he had his press conference on was it Wednesday or Tuesday or Wednesday, he said, it was nice to have these guys in for workouts. They had them both, Henderson and Miller, in for workouts twice, but it doesn't overrule what you've done for months. And the work that they did for months, said Brandon Miller, it is a lot of people think Brandon Miller is an excellent pick. A lot of people think Scoot Henderson was number 2 on the board, but it is I was hearing as far back as January that Brandon Miller was going to go to number 2, whoever it was. So that's what the Hornets went with. They have to trust their system, and we'll see. And Brandon Miller, what is he, 6'8", 6'9"? Excellent shooter, can put the ball on the floor. A lot going for him.
Big Paul George fan.
Well, I mean, I feel a little bad for Brandon Miller because when he answered this GOAT question with Paul George, it seemed pretty obvious to me. He was talking about how he's modeled his game after Paul George. And by the way,
he said my GOAT.
Well, yes, I know, but he even went on to say, he talked about how he's always tried to study his game. And if you watch clips of Brandon Miller, I do not pretend to be Jonathan Gavoni or Jeremy Wu. Those guys spend months looking at this stuff. If you just watch clips of Brandon Miller, you could see why or how he's been watching Paul George, right? Like you could see him turning into a Paul George type player, which if he did, that's a hell of a pick.
Literally the way he moves, like his sort of side to side movement, which is like sort of out of control, but in control at the same time. Like he clearly has studied his game.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, Paul
George, the Hornets will be thrilled.
Paul George is going to be a Hall of Famer. So
yeah.
that wouldn't be a bad pick at all. Okay. Of the things that in this draft that I'm going to take away, number 1, Indiana moves back 1 spot and drafts the guy that they were going to draft anyway, that they wanted to, Jarius Walker, at power forward. They pick up a couple of picks. Good business for the Pacers. By the way, the Pacers also earlier in the day moved down 7 spots in the second round of the draft, moved from pick 40 to 47. In the draft, they already had 4 picks in. They moved 7 spots down in the second round and got $4.7 million from the Lakers to do it. That has got to be one of the most aggressive cash moves in the history of the second round, and we've seen some crazy stuff.
Well, especially when it happened at like 6 o'clock. Like it wasn't like it happened when they were on the board. That's what I mean. It was very strange. Like just it was very odd.
The Lakers throw around $4 million like manhole covers. Let's just be honest. Okay.
I mean,
all right.
Listen, it's quite the move.
Secondly, the reason that I think Washington did that is that they believed that Indiana was going to trade number 7 elsewhere. And they moved up.
That was what I had heard too.
To get Bilal Coulibaly. I can't hang for 5 seconds in draft analysis with guys like Jeremy Wu and Jonathan Gavoni. However, Bilal Coulibaly is a guy that I have seen. And
Mr. Frenchman, Brian Windhorst.
Just to be clear to folks out there, Wendy did not fly to France just for a 90-second interview with
that's right.
with Vic when the lottery was
I think it was like 70. I think it was 75 seconds.
He was studying Bilal Coulibaly, the best friend of Victor Wembanyama,
who I watched in multiple games, including junior games and in practice. I was surprised he went 7th. definitely a high upside player because of size, but I'm not going to break it down here. I'm not good at it, but I'm just saying I was surprised he went 7th.
But
I was
if he was
surprised.
if he was going to go 7, it's going to be a team that is just entering a rebuild, right? Which Washington is. It was a high ceiling swing for a team that frankly is not trying to win next year. Now, listen, is Washington late as far as this, if you want to call it a tank thing, rebuild, whatever? Are they a year late? Obviously, but this new regime wasn't there last year, so don't blame them.
Well, and he also, I mean, he's one of the guys who's really had a lot of helium late in the draft process. He played really, really well down the stretch for Metropolitans. 92 was great at times in the playoffs for them, helped them get to the finals with Victor. Obviously lost to Monaco in the championship round, but like he'd shot up a bunch the last few weeks. And I mean, look, you watch clips of him, you could see why. Like, he's a big time athlete, long, athletic. I mean, if you walk around with Victor, they both, they certainly both look like they look the part of lottery picks. I spent a little time with those guys yesterday, and they're, I think Victor and his crew was hoping that he would wind up in San Antonio together because they clearly are very tight. But like you said, MacMahon, I think it's a great potential situation for him to go to Washington, a roster where they currently don't really have any wings, and like, hey, have him just roll out there and play and learn and just get a bunch of reps and experience. So it's a good landing spot for him. I thought it was slick work by Indiana. Jarris Walker is another guy who's interesting. Just size-wise, sort of reminds you of Paul Millsap. If he becomes a Paul Millsap type player, that would be great for Indiana. Should be a good fit with their young roster, with Tyrese Halliburton becoming a star there. Like, thought that was pretty slick work by them to get a couple seconds to get the guy they wanted anyway.
All right, why don't you talk about what Dallas did tonight, MacMahon?
Yeah, so obviously there was, I think number 10 was as discussed of a lottery pick as there was. And there was, the Mavericks explored a bunch of stuff. They had conversations with teams, and they went into this with 3 goals and not believing they would be able to achieve all 3. If they could have gone 2 out of 3, they'd have been very happy. They went 2 out of 3. Those 3 goals, in no particular order here: dump a bad contract, stay in the first round, but move down, and acquire a veteran starter. So obviously they did not acquire a veteran starter, but for them to be able to dump Davis Bertans' contract and move down 2 spots to take the guy who they liked at number 10 anyway, and Derek Lively II, who, listen, we'll see how much he's ready to contribute next year, but he
sure can block shots.
Right. They needed rebounding, rim protection, and big athleticism. He is certainly all those things. They said he shot the hell out of the ball at Clutch's pro day, but they're not expecting him to come in and be a floor spacing big. If he develops into that, that's a huge bonus. Michael Finley, the comparison he made, he said, I hate to do this because in Dallas, this guy's royalty, but he said he reminds me of a young Tyson Chandler, right? And, the vision is of this guy being a pick and roll partner for Luka Doncic, who's the defensive anchor, who's one of the best shot blockers in the league, who's a plus rebounder. Again, he's a one and done. We'll see if he's ready to do it right away. They're going to have to throw him out there some just for his development. And then with that trade exception that they got, they turned around later in the first round and picked up Rashawn Holmes from Sacramento, which it's a salary dump. The guy fell out of the Kings rotation last year, 29 years old. We'll see if he can contribute to the Mavs, but that's a salary dump. But then they get the 24th pick to get this Omax character who, six. I'm not going to try. Listen, I never thought
Olivia Maxis Prosper is his name.
There you go.
Just so people are aware, in case they're not draft nicks, who is this Omax guy?
After the Olivier St. John / Tariq Abdul-Wahad situation where Cuban had to pay him a whole bunch of money to not play for the Mavericks, I never thought he'd do another Olivier.
Hey, where did they draft Dorian Finney-Smith?
They didn't. Undrafted.
He was okay.
Yeah.
This is a 3 and D. I don't remember.
We're really killing it with the draft analysis tonight.
Yeah, he's a D. He can, he's 6'8", 7'1" wingspan, very athletic, going to have to develop as a 3-point shooter. That's the big question there. But look, they needed length. They needed athleticism. They got 2 first-round picks, and were able to still come out on top this year as far as the salary shifting, enough so to where they went from being a taxpayer mid-level team to a full mid-level team, which is a massive difference in being able to add another rotation player, potentially even a starter. And there was a lot of stuff out there about, like, for example, the Mavericks having discussions with the Hawks, which they absolutely did. Breaking news: the Hawks are trying to dump John Collins. Guess what? They were trying to dump him before they gave him this huge extension. They've been trying to dump him since the ink was dry. The Mavericks asked for Clint Capella. My understanding is the Hawks asked for the Mavericks to throw in Josh Green or Jaden Hardy, which is that's a no-go. Those are young players that the Mavericks really like. So instead of doing something like that, they drafted a guy who they believe can become a Capella type of player. Now, I don't know exactly what the discussions were with DeAndre Hunter is the player who would have been coming here. I do know that some people within the Mavs looked at and said, like the player, but not at that money.
Well, and let's real quick, because I obviously have been here at the draft dealing with stuff. I thought it was pretty slick work by Dallas to get essentially turn 10 into 2 first-round picks, sliding back to get a guy in Lively that Jonathan had at 10. Like you said, they got a ton of defensive athleticism, makes a lot of sense. What do we think? I mean, them getting the full mid-level, I didn't realize they'd done that with those moves. I knew they saved money this year. That is pretty significant to me. Like, do you have a sense of, like, is that try to get another wing defender type player? Is that something else? Like, what do you think they try to do there?
My best guess would be another wing defending type of player. And they've been very clear. And this is like a duh. They were one of the worst defensive teams in the league. They were one of the worst rebounding teams in the league. Those are the needs that they're trying to address. They are going to attempt to re-sign Kyrie Irving. I would say they are optimistic, and I would say the optimism is much more, I would say, realistic than it was with Jalen Brunson last year. Remember, last year, the Knicks moved a bunch of money around in the draft, and that's when that optimism went like, oh, wow, they really could create cap space that easy. Whereas I don't see another real option right now for Kyrie, right? So, point being, if they have Luke and Kyrie, they're going to be able to score. They've got to be able to stop somebody, and they've got to be able to rebound the damn ball. So those are the priorities there. And so, the one of the main reasons so many people thought the Mavericks were going to trade that 10th overall pick is because they have to win soon, right? We've talked about that time, tick, tick, tick.
Well, they drafted 2 guys in this draft that they could theoretically use as trade chips, plus whoever they sign.
Right.
They did well on assets. Plus, we'll see what Rashawn Holmes does.
Well, and the other thing is, it's not like the Mavericks it's not like they have to win X amount of games. Basically, the Mavericks just have to have this thing positioned to where Luka feels good about the future, right? And if so, hey, theoretically, if they go get a solid player with the mid-level, they're back in the playoffs next year, and he sees, wow, this Lively kid, I think he's going to be a good one. Hey, this Omax dude, like, okay, I see it.
Luka often has good outlooks like that. I agree.
Well, I'll say this, and I've said it the whole time. I do think I think he will look for reasons to stay in Dallas and not reasons he wants to leave. But again, last year, reasons were, you can't have another year like that. You can't have it where the reasons are punching you in the face. We talk about a lot of face punching this podcast.
Well, you are on it. In total speculation.
You have a punchable face.
Well, like I said, you're on the pod, so I knew it would come up. It feels like they could potentially be, in my mind, a Dylan Brooks team now that they have a full mid-level. What do we think of that? It's an interesting
I
fit with
think
their
Dylan Brooks
offense.
I think Dylan Brooks wants more in the mid-level.
I
Well,
would say I would
was.
say Dylan Brooks might end up in my state, but I don't necessarily think Dallas would be the spot.
I would tend to agree, but it was it's interesting trying to think about guys for the full mid-level, and with guys like Luka and Kyrie next to him, some of the other offensive issues for Dylan Brooks would be
All right, a couple
less
more
painful.
things.
No,
All
because
right,
he'd
couple
be
more
taking
things.
shots away from them.
All right,
Well,
a couple more
also
things
true.
here. In these trades, Oklahoma City. Now, last year, if you remember, Oklahoma City, they had the 12th pick, and they were sufficiently nervous about the Knicks pick, which was right in front of them, was on sale. And they were sufficiently nervous about somebody jumping in front of them and taking their player, which was Jalen Williams, that they traded to get the 11th pick and took it anyway. They did it again tonight. They had the 12th pick. They knew that the 10th pick in Dallas was very much on the market. They weren't sure what Dallas was doing.
Yeah.
So they move in and get the 10th pick just to make sure they get the guy that they wanted. How do you see? You said Case and Wallace? I am ignorant.
Case and Wallace, yeah.
Richardson, Texas, baby.
Case and Wallace from Kentucky. Maybe he'll
Richardson,
be a Hall of
Texas.
Famer. Maybe he'll be a bid player. I don't know. I just think it's interesting that they took on $22 million of Davis Bertans
Yeah.
to move up 2 spots in the draft.
Well, and look, you could say, hey, with this, you got to be at the floor. They're going to have to spend that money somehow. It's not like, Bricktown is some huge free agency destination. You can talk
Would
about
be
that.
for you.
Meh. I've been criticized by Bricktown residents for my infrequent appearances. Hey, I told them to get out of the G League, and they've done that. Oklahoma City actually is, I think, going to be a very interesting team sooner than later, potentially as soon as next season. I don't know. We'll see what Bertans.
Their big draft pick this year is Chet Holmgren.
Exactly.
The interesting.
But they need, their needs, rim protection, which Holmgren addresses that. 3-point shooting, which Holmgren also addresses, but maybe there's a little role for Bertans because you got to guard the guy. I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I thought it was a pretty expensive price.
Well, they didn't have to give up any of their picks, and salary space is what they have.
Yeah. Well, right. That's the interesting thing. So Bobby Marks already has Bertans into their money for next year, and even with him on the books, they now have basically somewhere between 12 and 15 guys, depending on what they do with Isaiah Joe, Jeremiah Robinson, Earl, and Aaron Wiggins. They're non-guaranteed guys.
Don't let Isaiah Joe go. That
I was going to say,
pretty confident Isaiah Joe's going to be on the team. I'm just saying.
I actually like Wiggins too.
No, I do too. But like they still are going to have a significant amount of money to get to the salary floor,
right?
Even with Bertans. And they might only have one roster spot. So if there was a team that was going to take on that much money, even though I think it's a lot of money to move up 2 spots in the draft, it does make sense that it's them. And look, we saw Mike Muscala fit in really well there as a floor space in 5. Yeah, hey, Davis Bertans out there with Chet. Maybe they can make it work.
What they did in the draft last year worked because Jalen Williams was a
Sam Presti knows what he's doing. I think it's safe to say.
Worked. That was interesting. Okay, now the thing that got my eyes going tonight. They used the trade exception that they're going to generate for trade. The Mavericks, offload Davis Bertans into the Thunder's cap space, creates a trade exception, which they turn around and use for Rashawn Holmes.
Why would Sacramento use the 24th pick to open up salary cap space? Why would they do that?
All of a sudden, the Sacramento Kings have more than $30 million in cap space. Pelton told me it was $36 million tonight, and I'll trust him. What's going on there, guys? What's going on there? And Pelton and I were talking about it on this show. I know that the Jordan Poole trade is a strong indication that Draymond Green is all sealed, signed, and delivered. He opted out of $27 million. I suspect the Warriors were hoping he would take a pay cut, kind of like I think the Bucks are hoping with Chris Middleton that he will reduce the front end of the salary and take longer money, or maybe take, even if it's the same money, take a descending contract.
To be clear, I still think that is what will happen.
Maybe.
But I'm not going to guarantee.
Hey,
I'm not guaranteeing it.
Man, I'm not
guaranteeing
saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying that Mike Brown and Draymond Green have a tremendous
sure.
relationship.
I was going to say, do they know
Draymond
each other?
And Draymond Green would be an incredible addition to the Kings.
What do the Kings
Incredible
need?
addition.
What do the Kings need?
They need a guy to be the defensive guy next to Sabonis, and they need a defensive voice, a veteran voice.
I do think it is a fascinating fit. I do think there could potentially be a lot of awkwardness with that fit. I mean, you have the whole Draymond was talking about. We began the pod talking about Draymond Green punching Jordan Poole in the face. Now we're talking about the guy that Draymond Green stopped on during the playoff series, playing next to him, Domantas Sabonis.
I've seen wider gulfs overcome.
I know. I do think it would be, I think, a bit of an awkward fit to try to play those two guys together. Obviously, they're both non-shooters. We'll see how Draymond looks when he's not playing with Steph and Clay. We've talked. I don't know if we talked about this on the pod.
I don't think we're going to see it. I just
no.
At the very least, it gives Draymond some.
They have a lot of salary.
The Warriors.
They have a lot of salary cap space now. Obviously, now part of this I think is it does set up the ability for Sacramento to renegotiate and extend Domantas Sabonis' contract. He has 1 year left on his deal. Obviously, had a fantastic year. Want him and De'Aaron Fox together going forward. I would be really interested in Sacramento trying to bring NorCal native Brook Lopez back to
you said
his
this to
home
me a couple
region.
of months ago, and I thought it was incredibly insightful then, and I think it's incredibly insightful now.
Because I think he does a lot of the same stuff for them that Draymond Green does, but he has the ability to space the floor, much like Miles Turner did when Domantas Sabonis played next to him. Now, obviously, with how fast the Kings like to play, Brook is obviously not the fastest guy, but I think that is a very interesting fit, and I think it might be cleaner. But the point is, the Kings have a lot of cap space. They had
to make this happen, they'd have
to
let Harrison Barnes go, just to be clear.
Well, I know, but Harrison Barnes was not that great during the playoffs, and they have the ability to potentially make a move to upgrade there. They can do a lot. It's a very interesting spot for them now. Coming off what's been the best year they had in a generation. There's a lot of momentum there, and they're now a team to really watch in free agency after opening this money up.
By the way, if you're bringing in Draymond, you probably need to let Harrison Barnes go because Draymond's still complaining about not getting invited to his wedding.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well,
Harrison's got a little hard feelings about Draymond recruiting KD, basically kicking him out of Golden State.
15 minutes after they lost Game 7, is that what you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with all that. And look, I'm not saying it's likely to happen. I'm just saying I know that Mike Brown and Draymond Green are very close. And if nothing else, it applies some pressure to the Warriors.
Hey, Draymond had De'Aaron Fox on as on his podcast.
Listen, that's clutch city right there.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Clutch city.
It's definitely interesting. It's definitely interesting.
I'm not going to go into much more detail. We have other coverage elsewhere at ESPN. The guys who are the draft experts that I did the show with tonight were surprised about Jett Howard going 11th.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I agree. I'm not sure what else to make out of the other stuff. We'll learn more about these guys. I'll learn more about these guys.
Well, Monty Bates went to the Cavs. That's an interesting one, late in the second round.
Cam
Guy
Whitman
who wants
the guy was the projected lottery pick who slid, and so
we had Trey Murphy on the show tonight, and he was talking about he went 17th, and he is still salty, and I'm going to underline it that he did not get invited to the green room on draft night, and he definitely still remembers, classically, all the teams who passed on him, and he remembers trying to bust some teams who passed on him as early as summer league. So I'm sure Cam Whitmore will do that.
Trey Murphy and Jordan Hawkins, the Connecticut guard that they drafted 14th on the wing shooting. Jordan Hawkins, I don't know how good an NBA player he's going to be, but you watch Jordan Hawkins shoot, and he's got about the perfect looking jump shot. Like I saw him play one day in the Big East tournament at the Garden, and I was sitting with Jeff Barzell, our college guy. I was like, "Oh, who's the number one? Who's like the top prospect in this game?" It was UConn and Providence. He goes, "Jordan Hawkins, got a guy in Connecticut." And Jordan Hawkins came down and took one jump shot. I said, "Oh, that's why he's a top 20 prospect."
Well,
like you just,
I will say,
he looks the
I
part,
will say
for sure.
that on the show, Trey called that they were going to get shooting. Not that that's shocking that an NBA team wants shooting, but
Well, Larry Nance was tweeting about, he was all fired up that they drafted a shooter also.
Right. So, all right. Well, more in the coming days. We got the highest volume transaction season coming up. It's well after midnight. Jackson is sitting 5 feet from me, and he's had a long day. So have I. So onward.
We almost made it through the pod without Brian complaining about being tired and overworked. We almost got to the end.
Hair still looks
Almost.
great though, Wendy.
The coif, perfect.
Yes. Well, I got the good lighting. I'm in the studio in Bristol right now, so I got the good lighting.
How's the chair though?
The chair is spectacular. Oh, it looks luxurious.
Good.
I could go to sleep in it because I've been up since 5:45.
Oh,
Thank you for listening to the Hoop
there it
Collective
is.
podcast. My flight tomorrow is at 6 a.m. It's a Hoop Collective podcast. Thank you to Jackson, who made it all happen. I forgot my microphone. He got me this really nice microphone, but I guess if you don't have a microphone in Bristol, we're in trouble.
Jackson is
Thank
the
you
real
to-
MVP.
Thank you to Tim Bontemps joining us on draft duty in Barclays. Thank you to Tim MacMahon joining us from Dallas. We will talk to you early next week.
Adios, amigos.